Have you ever picked up a needle and thread to sew, but struggled to thread the needle through the tiny eye? Just a slight tremor in your hand, frayed thread, or insufficient lighting can turn this seemingly simple task into a time-consuming and frustrating experience, especially when you need to quickly sew on a button or repair something around the house. Repeatedly trying to thread the needle without success is incredibly inconvenient. So today, I'll share some simple, quick, and easy needle threading tips to make sewing much easier. The first tip is a rather interesting way to thread a needle using only 2 needles. Very simple, but can make the process much faster than the usual method. First, prepare 2 sewing needles. Next, pull out a sufficient length of thread and place it horizontally on the tip of your index finger. This helps to secure the thread better, making the process easier and more precise instead of letting the thread move continuously. Then, take the first needle, the one you need to thread, and place the eyelet directly above the thread. At this point, adjust the thread so that it is in the correct position in the eyelet for easier manipulation in the next step. Next, take the second needle and gently hook the tip into the open eyelet of the first needle. This is the little trick of this method. Then, carefully use the second needle to gently lift and pull the thread through the eyelet. Once the thread is pulled up, simply gently pull the end of the thread through with your hand, and you're done. This way, the thread is quickly and neatly threaded through the needle without much effort. A small but very convenient trick, especially useful when the end of the thread is soft or difficult to align correctly with a small needle hole. The second tip is also a very simple way to thread a needle, and the principle is quite similar to the previous one, but this time I'll use a safety pin. First, take a sufficient length of thread and place it horizontally on your index finger to keep it stable and prevent it from shifting during the process. Next, take the needle you want to thread and place the eyelet directly above the thread, aligning it so that the thread is in the correct position in the eyelet. Then, instead of using a different needle, as in the previous tip, this time I'll use the pointed end of the safety pin. Gently insert the tip of the safety pin into the eyelet, then skillfully hook the thread underneath. Once the thread is hooked, slowly pull it upwards so that the end of the thread protrudes through the eyelet. Now, simply hold the end of the thread with your hand and pull it through to complete the process. This method is quite convenient because safety pins are small, easy to find, and their pointed ends are small enough to effectively thread the needle. If you need to sew but don't have a specialized needle threader, this is a quick and easy trick worth trying. The third tip is a rather interesting way to thread a needle using a toothbrush, a very familiar household item, but few people think it can be used this way. First, take out a clean toothbrush. Next, place the thread lengthwise on top of the toothbrush bristles. By placing it this way, the thread will be held securely on the surface of the small bristles, preventing it from slipping as much as when held by hand. Then, hold the needle you want to thread and gently press the needle hole down onto the thread. When pressed down, the toothbrush bristles will push the thread up, making it easier for the end of the thread to pass through the needle hole. With just a gentle movement, the thread can quickly pass through the needle hole. Then you just need to pull the end of the thread through with your hand to complete the process. This is a fairly simple but very convenient tip, especially when the needle hole is too small or you find it difficult to thread the needle the usual way. A familiar item, yet it can offer surprisingly helpful benefits. The fourth tip is a very clever way to thread a needle using a small piece of paper, especially useful when you don't have any tools nearby, but still want to thread quickly. First, take a thin piece of paper. Then, fold a small corner of the paper diagonally, about 1/4 of the way, and cut that corner off with scissors. Next, unfold the piece of paper you just cut. Now, place the thread in the center of the paper. Then fold the paper in half to hold the thread securely inside. Then, use scissors to cut diagonally the end of the paper to create a small pointed tip. This step is quite important because the pointed end will make it easier to thread through the needle eye, like a homemade threading tool. Once prepared, hold the pointed end of the paper and gently insert it into the needle eye. Because paper is stiffer than thread, this is usually much easier than trying to directly thread the soft end through the small needle eye. Once the piece of paper has passed through the needle hole, simply pull it slowly through, and the thread inside will be pulled along as well. Then, stretch the thread to the desired length and pull out the piece of paper to complete the process. So, with just a small piece of paper, you can turn it into a very convenient threading aid. A simple but extremely useful trick, especially when you need to sew quickly but don't have specialized tools. The final tip is a rather clever way to utilize the broom's nylon thread to create a simple threading tool at home. It sounds strange, but this method is quite effective, especially with needles that have small holes. First, cut a piece of nylon thread from the broom. Because nylon thread has just the right stiffness, but is still flexible enough, it's very suitable for use as a threading aid. Next, prepare a small wooden clip. Then, fold the nylon thread in half. And trim it slightly, leaving just enough length for easy handling and to fit the wooden clip. Next, place the folded nylon thread inside the wooden clip so that the front end protrudes and forms a small arch-like curve. At this point, the wooden clip will hold the nylon thread in place for easier manipulation. Now, take the needle you need to thread the arched end of the nylon thread through the needle hole. Because the fishing line is quite thin but stiffer than thread, this step will be much easier. Once the loop of fishing line has passed through the needle hole, simply thread the thread inside that arched section. Then, hold the needle and gently pull the fishing line straight back out. At this point, the thread will also be pulled through the needle hole very quickly. So, with just a piece of fishing line and a small wooden clip, you can create a very convenient needle threader yourself. This is a very useful tip if you often sew at home and don't have a specialized needle threader readily available. So, with just some very familiar household items, we now have many more quick and convenient ways to thread a needle. No more struggling with tiny needle holes. Simply apply one of these simple tricks, and sewing will become much easier. Hopefully, these little tips will be useful to you in your daily life. If you find them interesting, please save them for future use. Thank you for watching, and see you again in the next helpful and useful tips.